I let my sister live in my house for 8 years rent-free. She called the cops on my wife, so I kicked her out, and then I still remember the day my sister Sarah showed up at my doorstep. I was 26 years old, proud of myself because I had finally bought my first home. A little 3-bedroom place on the outskirts of Springfield, Missouri. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. I'd spent years working overtime shifts at the plant and living cheap to save up for that house. When I signed the papers and held the keys for the first time, it felt like I'd built the foundation for my future. And then, just a few months later, Sarah showed up. She was 19, scared out of her mind, and pregnant. I still remember her standing there on my front porch with her duffel bag and a nervous look in her eyes. It was early September, the air still sticky from summer. I was caught off guard. "What's going on, Sarah?" I asked. She hesitated before answering, staring down at her shoes. I have nowhere else to go, Derek. Mom can't take me in. She doesn't have the money, and I can't stay there anyway. Mom and I had been trying to keep things together after Dad left us years ago. She did her best as a single parent, but she'd always been on the edge financially. Sarah wasn't lying. Mom was barely holding on to her tiny rented apartment back in town. "I just need a place to stay for a little while," Sarah said, barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath and looked at her. She was my little sister, and despite the years of bickering and petty fights, I couldn't turn her away. "All right, come inside." And that's how it started. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Sarah was only supposed to stay for a few months, just until she got back on her feet. I didn't even have to think about the decision. Family helps family. That's how I was raised. The first few weeks were fine. Awkward, maybe, but manageable. I moved some of my old stuff out of the smallest bedroom, and Sarah turned it into a nursery. She kept to herself, and I did my best to support her. I even helped her with the baby when she got overwhelmed. Those nights when Tyler, her son, would cry at 2 a.m., I'd hear Sarah trying to calm him down. Sometimes, I'd just get up, knock on her door and say, "I've got him. You need some rest." I won't lie, there was a small part of me that liked feeling needed. I had this whole image of myself as the dependable older brother. Maybe it was because our childhood had been rough, and I always promised myself I'd do better for my family. Mom worked 2 jobs when we were kids, and it felt like Sarah and I grew up raising each other. Back then, I told myself that if anyone in my family ever needed help, I'd be the one to give it. Months went by, then a year, and then another year. Before I knew it, Sarah wasn't just living with me. She had fully settled in. Tyler learned to walk and talk in my house. Sarah started calling it home like it was hers too. And honestly, I let it happen. At first, I didn't mind. "Just a little longer," she'd say, when I brought up her plans. "I'm looking for jobs, Derek. I promise." It wasn't like Sarah was lazy. She kept her little space clean, mostly, and when Tyler was old enough, she'd take him to daycare and pick up occasional babysitting gigs. She'd even buy groceries sometimes, and I appreciated that. But the big issue, rent, never came up. I didn't ask her for money because I felt guilty. I knew she was struggling as a single mom, and the idea of being that guy, the guy who charges his own sister rent, made me feel like a jerk. But the problem was, over time, things got too comfortable for her. A couple of years in, Sarah met someone new, a guy named Mike. I won't get into the details, but let's just say Mike didn't stick around long after Sarah got pregnant again. It was like deja vu. Tyler was 4 when Sarah gave birth to her second son, Jordan, and suddenly, I was living with not 1, but 2 kids running around my house. By this point, my home wasn't really mine anymore. It was noisy, cluttered, and always a little messy. My living room was filled with toys and juice boxes. My backyard had become the boys' playground, and I tried to roll with it. I really did, because I loved my nephews. Tyler and Jordan were good kids, even if they were loud as hell and constantly leaving muddy footprints everywhere. Still, it was hard not to feel resentful sometimes. My house had turned into something I hadn't signed up for, and I couldn't help but feel trapped. One night, when I got home from work, Sarah was sitting on the couch watching TV. She looked up and smiled. "Hey, Derek. I made spaghetti. It's in the kitchen if you want some." I mumbled a quick thanks and walked down the hall to my room. I remember standing there for a minute, staring at the walls, realizing how little of my house still felt like mine. It hit me all at once. I'd worked for years to build this life, this home, and I felt like I'd handed it over without even realizing it. And then, 4 years ago, everything changed. I met Hannah. Hannah was beautiful, smart, and the kind of person who made you feel calm just by being around her. She worked as a teacher at one of the local elementary schools, and we hit it off right away. She was patient, kind-hearted, and somehow, despite knowing about my sister's situation, she didn't run for the hills when we started dating. When I told her about Sarah living with me, I remember her nodding thoughtfully. "That sounds complicated," she said, "but you're a good man for helping her." We dated for a couple of years before I proposed. Hannah said yes, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was building something for me. My life was finally moving forward. When Hannah and I got married, she moved in with me. She'd been nothing but patient about Sarah living there, but I could tell the situation wasn't easy for her. It's not exactly a dream come true to move into a house where your husband's sister and her 2 kids have already claimed half the space. Hannah never outright complained, but she dropped hints. "How long do you think Sarah will stay?" she asked me one night, months after moving in. "I don't know," I admitted. "She doesn't have anywhere else to go." Hannah nodded, but her expression said it all. She was trying to make the best of it, but she felt like a guest in her own home. And deep down, I knew it wasn't fair to her. That's when things started to shift. Hannah had always been into gardening. It was her passion. She told me she'd grown up helping her grandma plant flowers and vegetables every summer, and it brought her peace. For months, she talked about turning our front yard into a beautiful garden. "It'll be small," she said, smiling as she described it. "Just some flowers, a few shrubs, and maybe a bench where we can sit together. It'll make the house feel ours." I loved the idea. Our yard was nothing special, just grass and a couple of sad bushes, and I figured a garden would brighten up the place. Hannah deserved to feel like this house was hers, too. We decided to hire contractors to do the heavy work. Tear up the grass, prep the soil, and lay everything out. Hannah planned to take a day off work to supervise. It seemed simple enough. Looking back now, I realize I should have mentioned it to Sarah ahead of time, but at the time, it didn't even cross my mind. I mean, it's my house, right? Why would she care? I had no idea what kind of storm I was about to unleash. The day the contractors came, I was at work like usual. I didn't think much of it. Hannah had the day off to oversee everything, and I was just excited for her. She'd been planning this garden for months, down to every flower and shrub she wanted. I figured I'd come home that night and see her beaming, proud of her little project. Instead, I came home to chaos. It all started that morning. Hannah said the workers showed up at 8 sharp, ready to get to work. She was outside with them, marking the spots they needed to tear up and chatting about what would go where. From what Hannah told me later, everything seemed fine at first. Sarah had come out onto the porch in her pajamas, holding a mug of coffee, barely acknowledging Hannah with a mumbled morning before going back inside. But then Sarah noticed the workers. At first, she just watched them from the window, trying to figure out what they were doing. When it clicked that they were ripping up the front yard, the place where her boys played every day, she lost it. Sarah stormed out of the house like a hurricane, barefoot and still in her baggy sleep clothes, her face twisted with anger. She started yelling before she even got down the porch steps. "What are you doing? Stop! Stop!" The workers froze, looking at each other like they weren't sure what to do. Hannah, trying to stay calm, stepped forward. "Sarah, relax. It's fine. Derek and I hired them. We're putting in a garden." Sarah whipped around to face Hannah like she'd just heard the most offensive thing in the world. "A garden? You're tearing up the yard? Where my kids play?" Hannah kept her voice steady, though I know how hard it must have been. "It's not just the yard, Sarah. This is our home too, and we decided it was time for a change. I thought it would make the place nicer." Sarah wasn't having it. "You thought? You thought? You didn't even ask me." "Ask you?" Hannah said, her patience starting to crack. "Sarah, it's not your decision. It's not your house." That set her off completely. "You can't just come in here and start changing everything. This has been my home for years. My kids play in this yard every single day, and you're just destroying it without even telling me." The workers, probably realizing they were in the middle of something they didn't want to be part of, kept their heads down and slowly resumed their work. Sarah wasn't having that either. She turned on them next. "I said stop," she screamed, waving her arms like she was trying to block off the yard. "You don't have permission to touch anything. Pack up your stuff and get out." That's when Hannah stepped in again, her voice sharper this time. "Actually, they do have permission. Derek and I hired them, and this is happening. You don't get to tell them to stop, Sarah." Sarah shot back like a firecracker. "I have just as much right as you do. I've lived here for almost 8 years, Hannah. You think you can just waltz in and act like you own the place?" The yelling must have been loud enough to wake the entire block, because that's when Denise got involved. Now, Denise was one of those neighbors who had a knack for being in everyone else's business. She lived next door for as long as I'd had the house, and since Sarah had kids around the same age as hers, the two of them had grown friendly over the years. Too friendly, if you ask me. Denise treated Sarah like they were in some exclusive club of struggling single moms, which I tried to stay out of. Hannah told me later she didn't even see Denise walk over. She just turned around, and there she was, standing with her arms crossed like she was presiding over a courtroom. "What's going on here?" Denise asked, her voice dripping with that nosy concern she was famous for. Sarah, clearly thrilled to have an audience, turned to her. "She's tearing up the yard. This is where my boys play, and she didn't even tell me." Denise's eyebrows shot up as she glanced at the workers. "Is this true?" she asked Hannah. "Did you just start tearing up the yard without telling her?" Hannah was stunned. "It's not her yard to approve, Denise. It's Derek's and mine." Denise didn't back down. "Well, I don't think it's right to make changes like this without everyone's input. She's lived here for years. She has rights, you know." Sarah nodded, clearly emboldened. "Exactly. This is my home too. You can't just do whatever you want." At this point, Hannah told me she was shaking with anger. "This isn't your home, Sarah. Derek and I are married. It's our house, and we're allowed to make changes without your approval. You're not the owner." That's when Denise did something that still makes my blood boil. She pulled out her phone and called the police. Yes, the police. Apparently, Denise told the dispatcher there were unauthorized workers on the property and that Hannah, not the owner, according to her, was making changes without permission. Hannah couldn't believe what was happening. The workers were standing there awkwardly, tools in hand, trying to figure out if they should keep going or pack up. Meanwhile, Sarah was off to the side, arms crossed, looking smug. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, which I guess is what happens when you live in a quiet neighborhood with nothing else going on. From what Hannah told me, the officers were professional but confused. Denise was standing there practically pointing fingers at Hannah, while Sarah told her sob story about how she'd lived there for years and how Hannah was destroying her boys' only play space. Hannah did her best to explain. "This is my home. My husband and I agreed on this. We hired these workers, and they're doing exactly what we asked them to do. But because I wasn't there to confirm anything and the house was technically under my name, the officers didn't know what to believe. Instead of risking further conflict, they asked Hannah to leave for the night just to cool things down. Hannah didn't fight them. She told me later that by that point, she was humiliated. She grabbed an overnight bag, texted her sister to let her know she'd be staying over, and left the house, her own home, escorted by the police like she was some kind of criminal. When I finally found out what happened, I was sitting in the break room at work on my lunch break. I picked up my phone and saw a dozen missed calls from Hannah. My heart sank. I called her back immediately, and the second I heard her voice, I knew something was seriously wrong. "Hannah, what's going on? Are you okay?" Her voice cracked as she answered. "Your sister called the cops on me, Derek. I'm at my sister's house. They made me leave." I felt like the floor dropped out from under me. "What?" I whispered, my stomach twisting, and that's when I knew things with Sarah had gone way too far. I left work early that day, practically sprinting to my car. I didn't even bother telling my supervisor why. I just grabbed my keys, clocked out, and peeled out of the parking lot. The hour-long drive home felt endless. My thoughts were racing, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. How could this happen? How did my sister think it was even remotely okay to call the cops on my wife? And Hannah, my poor wife, being treated like she didn't belong in her own home. I felt like I'd failed her. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was shaking with anger. The yard was half torn up, the contractor's tools abandoned in the dirt. I barely noticed because I was too focused on what awaited me inside. When I opened the front door, there was Sarah, sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of cartoons playing on the TV in the background. It was surreal. "Where's Hannah?" I asked, my voice strained but steady. Sarah glanced up like she was mildly inconvenienced by my presence. "She left," she said flatly, then turned her attention back to her phone. "She left?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Sarah, what the hell is going on? Why did you call the cops on her?" Sarah let out a long sigh like she was already tired of the conversation. "I didn't have a choice, Derek. She was ruining the yard. She didn't even tell me about it." "She doesn't have to tell you." I exploded. "It's my house. It's Hannah's house. You don't get a say in this." Sarah shot up off the couch, the phone forgotten. "This has been my home for almost 8 years, Derek. You don't just get to make changes without talking to me first. My kids play in that yard every day. Do you even care about how this affects them?" I stared at her, dumbfounded. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Sarah, are you serious? This isn't your house. You've been living here rent-free for years because I let you. I've given you a place to raise your kids, and you repay me by having my wife escorted out by the police?" Her face turned red, but she didn't back down. "You're being ridiculous. You let me live here, yes, but this is my home, too. I've built a life here. You can't just decide to change everything overnight and expect me to be okay with it. You don't get to act like you own this place." I shot back, my voice sharp. "You've never paid rent. You've never contributed a single dime to this house. Do you even understand what you've done? Hannah, my wife, was humiliated because of you." And that's when she said it, the words that made my blood boil. "I have tenants' rights," Sarah said, crossing her arms. "You can't just do whatever you want anymore." I froze, blinking at her in disbelief. "Tenants' rights? What did you just say?" Sarah repeated herself, this time quieter, but with more defiance. "I have tenants' rights. I've lived here for years, Derek. Legally, you can't kick me out or make changes without giving me notice." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My own sister, who I had taken in when no one else would, who I had fed, supported, and let live in my house for free, was now throwing tenants' rights in my face. Like she was some paying renter who deserved equal say over my property. I couldn't look at her. My fists clenched at my sides as I turned and stormed out of the house. I needed air. I needed to get away before I said, or did something I'd regret. I sat on the porch steps, staring out at the half-destroyed yard. The silence outside was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of cars driving by. My hands were shaking, not with fear, but with sheer frustration. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was Hannah. "Hey," I answered quietly. Her voice was soft but edged with exhaustion. "Are you home?" "Yeah, I'm here," I said. "Where are you?" "At my sister's. I didn't want to go back tonight." I rubbed my face, ashamed of the situation I'd let spiral out of control. "Hannah, I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say. It's not your fault, Derek," she interrupted gently, though I could hear how hurt she still was. "But it's not okay. I'm your wife. That's supposed to be our home. And she had me kicked out like I was some stranger." Her words cut deep, not because she was wrong, but because she was absolutely right. This was supposed to be our home. I'd let the situation go on for so long, afraid to confront Sarah, that now my marriage was being dragged into the mess. "This ends now," I told Hannah. "I'm going to fix this. I promise." When I hung up, I sat there for a long time, thinking about how everything had spiraled. Sarah had taken advantage of my kindness for years, but I had been just as much to blame. I'd let it happen. I'd let her stay rent-free, let her kids run wild through the house, let her treat my home like it was her own. And now, she was weaponizing tenants' rights against me. It had to stop. I went back inside, and Sarah was sitting at the dining room table, still fuming. I didn't waste time. "You need to move out," I said, my voice firm. Sarah looked up at me like I just told her the world was ending. What? You heard me, I said. This has gone way too far. Calling the police on Hannah? Screaming at contractors in the yard? Talking about tenants' rights? No, Sarah. This is my house and you're leaving. Her face crumpled, and for a second, I thought she might cry. You're kicking me out? Over a garden? Are you serious right now? This isn't about the garden. I snapped. This is about respect. This is about you treating my wife like she doesn't belong in her own home. I've let you stay here for free, Sarah. I've helped you raise your kids. And this is how you repay me? She stood up, her voice rising to match mine. I have nowhere else to go, Derek. I'm your sister. You can't just throw me out because Hannah doesn't like me. This isn't about Hannah not liking you. I shouted back. It's about the fact that you don't get to run my house anymore. I love you, Sarah, but you've crossed a line, and I'm done pretending like this is okay. Sarah stormed off to her room, slamming the door behind her hard enough to rattle the walls. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself down, my breath coming in heavy bursts. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking back control of my home. It wasn't going to be easy. Nothing about this situation was easy, but I had made up my mind. Sarah was moving out. One way or another, I was going to make it happen. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Sarah's boys stomping around in the hallway. Tyler and Jordan were laughing as they barreled past my bedroom door, already awake and running wild like nothing had happened. For a second, it was easy to forget about the night before, about the yelling, the slammed doors, and the weight of what I'd said to Sarah. But then reality hit me like a freight train. I dragged myself out of bed, pulled on some clothes, and walked out to find Sarah sitting in the living room with her coffee, acting like everything was perfectly normal. She was scrolling through her phone while cartoons played on the TV. Tyler and Jordan were sitting on the floor, eating dry cereal straight from the box. Sarah glanced up at me, her face completely blank. Morning. I didn't respond. I just stood there for a moment, staring at her and feeling that pit of frustration settle in my chest again. It was like nothing I'd said last night had even registered with her. I took a deep breath and walked over to the kitchen, determined to follow through with what I decided. When I got back, I didn't waste time. I sat down across from Sarah at the table, a stack of papers in my hand. She raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed. "What's that?" she asked. "Your written notice," I said, holding the papers out to her. She didn't take them. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," I replied, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I talked to a lawyer this morning. You have 60 days to move out. I'm giving you more time than I have to because I want you and the boys to land on your feet. But I mean it, Sarah. You're moving out." She stared at me for a long second, like she couldn't believe the words coming out of my mouth. "You actually went to a lawyer?" "Yes," I said. "You threw tenants' rights at me, so I'm doing this the right way. By the book." Her jaw tightened, and she finally stood up, crossing her arms over her chest. "You're unbelievable. I'm your sister, Derek. Your sister. You're really kicking me and my kids out over a stupid garden?" I pushed the papers closer to her, refusing to back down. "It's not about the garden. It's about respect, Sarah. You don't get to call the cops on my wife and act like this is your house. I've let you stay here for 8 years. 8 years, Sarah. For free. I've helped you raise your kids. I've given you a roof over your head, and I never asked for anything in return. But you crossed a line and I'm done." Her voice cracked. "What am I supposed to do? Where are we supposed to go?" "I don't have any money, Derek." I sighed, softening just a little. "I'll help you, okay? I've already started looking into resources, places that help single moms find housing. I'll even help you pack or put money toward a deposit for your next place. But you can't live here anymore." Sarah's face turned red, and she slammed her mug down on the table. "I can't believe this. I really can't. After everything we've been through, after everything I've gone through, you're throwing me and my kids out like we're trash." I leaned forward, my patience thinning. "Don't do that, Sarah. Don't act like you're the victim here. You're the one who took advantage of me for years. I tried to help you, but you turned my kindness into an excuse to avoid responsibility." Her eyes welled up with tears, but I didn't let it shake me. I was done feeling guilty for standing up for myself, for standing up for my wife. 60 days, I repeated quietly. That's more than fair. Sarah didn't say another word. She snatched the papers off the table, crumpled them up, and stormed down the hallway to her room, slamming the door so hard that a picture on the wall tilted sideways. The boys flinched at the noise, and Tyler turned to me with wide eyes. "Is Mommy mad?" he asked softly. I looked at him, guilt gnawing at my insides. I forced a small smile. "No, buddy. She's just upset right now. It'll be okay." I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince, him or myself. That afternoon, I called Hannah. She was still staying at her sister's house, and I could tell how exhausted she sounded just by the way she answered the phone. "Hey," I said. "I talked to Sarah this morning. I gave her the 60-day notice." There was silence on the other end for a moment before Hannah finally responded. "And what did she say?" I let out a breath. "She's pissed, but I don't care anymore. I'm not letting her stay here. Not after what she did to you. Are you sure you're okay?" Hannah asked gently. "Yeah," I replied, though it didn't feel entirely true. "It's not easy, but it's the right thing to do. I need you to come home, Hannah. This is your house too, and I won't let anyone make you feel otherwise." She hesitated. "Are you sure it's safe?" "I don't want to come back if she's going to act like that again." "She won't," I promised. "I'll make sure of it." Hannah finally agreed to come home the next morning, and I felt like I could breathe a little easier. I needed her back. I needed her to know that she came first, that our marriage came first. But as relieved as I felt, I also knew that the next 60 days were going to be hell. For the rest of the week, Sarah avoided me like the plague. She stayed locked in her room most of the time, coming out only when she needed to feed the boys or let them play outside. The tension in the house was unbearable. Every time I heard a door creak or the sound of footsteps in the hall, my chest tightened. Hannah moved back in on Saturday morning, and the first thing she did when she walked through the door was let out a long sigh. "It feels different in here," she said, setting down her overnight bag. I nodded. "I know. It's not going to be like this for much longer. I promise." We sat on the couch that night, the house eerily quiet except for the faint sound of Sarah's TV coming through the walls. Hannah curled up next to me, resting her head on my shoulder. "I hate that it came to this," she whispered. "Me too," I admitted. "But it needed to happen." She looked up at me, her eyes full of the kind of sadness that cuts deep. "Do you think she'll actually leave? Or do you think she's going to fight you on it?" I didn't answer right away because, honestly, I wasn't sure. I'd given Sarah the notice. I'd been clear with her. But I knew my sister, and I knew she was stubborn enough to drag this out for as long as she could. "I don't know," I said finally. "But if she fights me, I'll be ready." Hannah squeezed my hand. "I just want us to have our home back, Derek." "We will," I told her. "No matter what it takes." But deep down, I had a sinking feeling that Sarah wasn't going to make this easy. The next few weeks were some of the longest, most miserable weeks of my life. Sarah avoided me completely, and when she wasn't avoiding me, she was slamming doors, stomping around the house, or muttering things just loud enough for me to hear. She didn't say much to Hannah either, which was probably for the best. The tension in the house felt like a live wire. One wrong move, and the whole place might go up in flames. Most nights, I'd hear her on the phone through the thin walls, her voice sharp and bitter as she vented to whoever was on the other end. "Can you believe he's actually kicking me out? His own sister, with 2 kids. I have nowhere to go, but I guess family doesn't mean anything to him anymore." Hearing her say that made me want to punch a hole through the wall. It was like every ounce of kindness I'd ever shown her had vanished in her mind. I'd given her 8 years of free rent, a roof over her kids' heads, and all the support I could muster, and yet she was painting me as the villain to anyone who would listen. I tried not to let it get to me, but it wasn't easy. The final straw came on a Sunday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking my coffee and scanning some listings I'd found for affordable apartments. I had a stack of papers full of resources sitting next to me, low-income housing leads, single mom programs, even offers from a couple of friends who had extra rooms to rent out. I was doing everything I could to help Sarah move out as smoothly as possible, even though she didn't deserve it. That's when she walked in. She stopped in the doorway and just stared at me for a second, her expression cold. I looked up from the papers. "Morning," I said cautiously. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she grabbed a cup from the counter and poured herself coffee with her back to me. Finally, she spoke. "You're really going through with this?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "I am." She turned to face me, holding the mug in both hands. "So that's it? You're choosing her over your own family?" I sighed, already tired of where this was headed. "It's not about choosing anyone over anyone, Sarah. It's about boundaries and respect. You crossed the line and you know it." Sarah scoffed. "Boundaries? You want to talk about respect, Derek? You're throwing me and my kids out over grass. Grass and a stupid garden. It's not about the garden." I snapped, my voice rising. I had tried to stay calm for weeks, but I was at my breaking point. "Stop pretending this is about the yard. It's about how you handled it, Sarah. You called the cops on my wife, and had her escorted out of her own home. You embarrassed her in front of the entire neighborhood. You don't get to act like you're the victim here." Her eyes narrowed. "I did what I had to do to protect my kids. You don't get that because you don't have kids of your own." The words hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I pushed the stack of papers across the table toward her. "Here," I said. "I've been looking for places you can move into. Apartments, shelters, even some programs for single moms. I'll help you with a deposit if you need it, Sarah. I'm not just throwing you out onto the street, but you're leaving. You have 60 days, and I mean it." She stared at the papers like they were poison, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "Wow," she said softly. "You're really serious about this." "Yes, I am." Sarah shook her head and looked away, tears starting to form in her eyes. "You're a real piece of work. You know that? I hope you can live with yourself when my kids are sleeping in a shelter because of you." I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "Don't you dare try to guilt me, Sarah. I've helped you for 8 years. 8 years. I've given you everything I could, and all you've done is take advantage of me. This isn't my fault. It's yours." She didn't say another word. She just turned and walked out of the kitchen, her footsteps heavy as they faded down the hallway. That afternoon, Hannah and I were sitting in the living room when I saw Sarah's favorite partner in crime, Denise, walking up to my front porch. My stomach dropped immediately. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," I muttered, getting up and heading for the door. I stepped outside before Denise could knock. She gave me a wide, fake smile as she folded her arms across her chest. "Hi, Derek. Can we talk for a second?" "No," I said flatly, crossing my arms to match hers. Her smile faltered, but she kept her fake sweetness intact. "I just wanted to check in on Sarah. She told me what's going on, and—" "This doesn't concern you, Denise," I said sharply. "Whatever Sarah told you, it's between her and me. You don't need to insert yourself into our business." Denise blinked, looking caught off guard. "Well, I just think it's awful that you're forcing your sister and her kids out of their home. They've been here for so long." I cut her off, pointing a finger at her. "Stop calling it their home. It's not their home. It's my house. I let Sarah live here out of kindness, but that doesn't mean she gets to act like she owns the place. And frankly, Denise, you need to stay out of it. You've already done enough damage." Her face soured, and she put her hands on her hips. "I'm just trying to look out for her." "No, you're not," I shot back. "You're stirring the pot and making things worse. You called the police on my wife, Denise. Do you understand how screwed up that is?" She opened her mouth like she was about to argue, but I wasn't done. "You're not welcome here anymore. If I see you on my property again, I'll call the police myself and have you removed. Do I make myself clear?" Her jaw dropped slightly, and for a moment, she looked like she wanted to yell at me. But instead, she turned on her heel and marched off the porch, muttering something under her breath. I stood there, watching her walk back to her house, and slammed the door shut behind me. When I turned around, Hannah was standing in the living room doorway, watching me. "Good," she said simply. She needed to hear that. I nodded, still fuming. "I'm done being the nice guy. Sarah's moving out, and Denise can mind her own damn business." Hannah walked over and wrapped her arms around me, her voice soft. I know this isn't easy for you, Derek, but you're doing the right thing. I hope so, I said quietly, holding her close, because I don't know how much more of this I can take. The next day, Sarah finally started packing. I didn't say anything to her, and she didn't say anything to me. She moved around the house like a ghost, gathering her things piece by piece while the boys played outside. That night, I heard her crying in her room after she thought everyone had gone to sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the muffled sound, and for a second, I felt like the worst brother in the world. But then I remembered how Hannah had been treated. I remembered how Sarah had screamed at her in front of the workers, how she had let Denise call the cops, and how Hannah had to leave her own house with an overnight bag like some kind of intruder. It wasn't just about the garden. It never had been. This was about respect, about boundaries, about taking back control of my home. I lay down, staring at the ceiling, and told myself the same thing I'd been telling Hannah for weeks. It's the right thing to do. It has to be.